morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director of GWIX. And thank you for joining our North Korea Economic Forum panel discussion, co-hosted with the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University. And now let me turn it over to Jisoo Kim, Director of GWIX, and Pumsoo Kim, Director of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, for opening remarks. Jisoo?
Hey, thank you, Yeonho. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our North Korea Economic Forum's virtual panel discussion titled Reviewing North Korea's Progress and Reforms in Agriculture and Finance. I would like to begin by thanking Director Pumsoo Kim of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University and his team for co-sponsoring today's event. We have collaborated several times so far, and I hope our partnership continues to generate important discussions on North Korea. We're also grateful to have distinguished speakers today sharing their expertise on North Korea's agriculture and finance. I would also like to express my special thanks to our North Korea Economic Forum board members today. We could not run this forum without their contribution. So throughout the academic year, we host several closed-door meetings and 2 public events, and one is in the fall and the other is in the spring, which is today's event for this academic year. So I just want to mention briefly about the fall event because this is a conference based on papers that are published through the policy and research paper series on the North Korean economy. And I mention this because it was just published yesterday. So so I just want to announce and promote our paper series. It's entitled Understanding Market Activities in North Korea. And I want to thank all those who made it possible to publish the papers. And in addition to authors, I would like to especially acknowledge our board members, Bill Brown, who is the chair and speaking today, Bill Newcomb, Troy Stangarone, and Rachel Lee, who's also speaking today. And finally, but not least, Yeonho, who's worked so hard to do the editing and to get this paper series published. So thanks again to all our distinguished speakers today, and I look forward to learning from their insightful views. Thanks.
Thank you. Pumsoo?
Good morning and good evening, everyone. Actually, I prepare my opening remarks, but I think Director Jisoo Kim already mentioned many things, and I think almost 60% of my opening remark is the same as Jisoo mentioned just before, so that I try to brief my opening remarks officially. Anyway, first of all, on behalf of the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University, I would like to welcome all of you to this wonderful webinar co-hosted by the Institute for Korean Studies at the George Washington University. As many of you already know, the Institute for Peace and Unification Studies, which was established on April 12, 2006, has conducted various research projects focusing not only on inter-Korean relation and North Korean issues, but also on global issues in general under the motto of pioneering dialogue, research, and action for unification and global peace. Today, with the generous support of the Institute of Korean Studies at the George Washington University, we will co-host webinar titled Reviewing North Korea's Progress on Reform in Agriculture and Finance. As many of you already know, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, North Korea seemed to struggle and experience many economic difficulty and shortage of food. To overcome these difficulties, it is known that North Korean government and the ruling Workers' Party took many reforms. So today, we will examine how these reforms are going on, especially in the area of agriculture and finance. I think this topic is very relevant for understanding the current status of North Korean economy, and I hope all of you enjoyed today's webinar. Finally, I would express my sincere thanks to Director Jisoo Kim, Professor Yeonho Kim, as Chair of GW Institute for Korean Studies for coordinating and preparing all the arrangement. And great thanks to our distinguished speakers, Dr. Young-Hoon Kim, Ms. Rachel Lee, Professor Hyuk Jung, and Mr. William Brown for their wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pomsu. Then let me start the first panel on North Korea's agricultural sector. We are fortunate to have two distinguished speakers for this panel. The first speaker is Young-Hoon Kim, an honorary senior researcher at the Korea Rural Economic Institute. He has visited North Korea many times, actually, in connection with inter-Korean agricultural cooperation projects, and has advised project implementers and the South Korean government. The next speaker is Rachel Min-young Lee, the Regional Issues Manager and Senior Analyst with the Vienna-based Open Nuclear Network. She's joining from Vienna actually now, and a non-resident fellow with the 38 North program at the Stimson Center. Rachel was a North Korea collection expert and an analyst with open source enterprise under the CIA from 2000 to 2019. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask the audience to refer to our program for their full bios. After their presentations, we will invite two other speakers for the next panel to make comments or ask questions. And I think Pomsu, who will moderate the next panel, will introduce both of them. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Kim.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. I'm Kim Young-Hoon, who is working for Korea Rural Economic Institute. Today, I'm going to tell you about the food supply and the agricultural policy changes. And I understand Rachel will tell us about the agricultural reform. But what I'm going to tell you today is kind of going against the agricultural reform because their policies are going against the agricultural reform they are arguing about. So let me first touch upon the economic recession and the food shortage. In the 2000s, there can be some keywords: economic isolation, the siege economy, low production, and supply shortage. This is the keyword for their economy, and agriculture is not the exception. They have the food shortage. Food production has been going down compared to the beginning of the Kim Jong-un era. Currently, the production is around 4.6 million. The population is increasing. Population is increasing, but the production is going down, which means the absolute food shortage is going up compared to the past. When you take a look at the data of the 2012, and the lack was around 1 million. But as you can see, in the year of the 2015 and the 2016, the shortage was around 1.3 million. Last year, in 2022, the grain production in North Korea dropped compared to 2 years ago. It was around 4.5 million. It was a reduction compared to 2020, and it is the 3.8% reduction, which is around 180 tons drop. In every grain, you can see the negative growth, and you can see the wheat barley only grew by 12.5% positively. Then why the food production was in decline? There can be many factors. The biggest factors, I would say, there are two. According to the Agriculture Promotion Agency, the unfavorable agriculture weather was the biggest contributor, and the bad weather during the growing season was really bad factor. Also, decline in chemical fertilizer supply was a significant flow. And usually they import half of the fertilizer and they produce half of the fertilizer demand within North Korea. However, the import dropped significantly, so they will lack of the supply for fertilizer. The fertilizer is really important, especially chemical fertilizer is really important for the food production. But because of the lack of the fertilizer in 2022, the food production was going down. However, that does not mean they were fully lack of the fertilizer, because even though they were lack of the chemical fertilizer, North Korea came up with some measures. For example, they supply compost or organic fertilizer, especially last year. They worked on a huge national campaign. And they have the coal, which was used for the export. However, because of the sanction, they cannot export any coal. So the domestic coal could have been used for the chemical fertilizer. The coal gasification process was used to produce chemical fertilizer. So it is likely the domestic production of the chemical fertilizer increased. Grain production is really important. So when allocating the fertilizer, North Korea usually comes up with the policy priority. So the lack of the fertilizer did not have a huge impact on the grain production itself. Compared to the early 2010, the food production is going down. In 2022, it got even worse. Then, what is the reflection on North Korea's agricultural policy? Are they going to keep the status quo? And probably they were maintaining their previous policy. That is why they came up with lower production. So North Korea should come up with a policy change. And let me give you a few backgrounds about it. The first one is the economic sanction become even stronger. In 2017 and 2018, yes, the international sanction against North Korea got really significant. In 2020, they were suffering from COVID-19 and their economy was going down. Right now, the crop production was decreasing compared to the early days of the Kim Jong-un era, even though they made many policy efforts. But anyway, the crop production was decreasing. Kim Jong-un in 2021 made a comment. He condemned everything is force, and the force reporting is an issue. So, because against these backdrops, North Korea came up with the new policy about agriculture. There are two documents, and there are changes in many of the laws and the regulations. In September of the 2021, Kim Jong-un made a speech. He usually talked about the microscopic agricultural task. The second document was released in 2021 in December within the Central Committee of the Labor Party. He said, macroscopic or the macro agriculture strategy is really important. Between 2020 to 2022, there were amendments of the many laws, and there are some laws and the regulations related to agriculture. Sometimes they came up with new regulation and legislation about agriculture to support their new agricultural policy. Now, let me tell you about the key changes in their agricultural policy. First, let me touch upon the macroscopic agricultural strategy. The self-reliance and the socialist economy were underlined. And in response to isolation, and they are making some changes. In the mid of the 2010s, under the Kim Jong-un, they were trying to become more open and expand the market. However, in the 2020s, they become more conservative. As for the microscopic agricultural task, they are making many suggestions. There are something new, and it can be summarized in 4 items. The first one is the response to the disastrous abnormal climate. And the second one is transforming of the staple grain from usually in the past, they were relying on rice and corn, but now they are making a transformation to rice and wheat instead of the corn. The third one is they came up with the new government level purchase for the grain. And also they are strengthening the government investment, targeting the machinery and the special assistance to South Hwanghae province. And they are giving an exemption for the tax or the tax for the cooperative farms. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the amendments of the laws and the legislations. In the past, they had the agricultural policy and agricultural strategy. They made a few changes, but there have not been many cases that were supported or backed by legislation. However, North Korea came up with new legislation and they amended the relevant laws and legislation, which means they are strongly willing to make changes. You can see the centralized planning and control have been more solidified when you take a look at the contents of the amendment. Let me give you a few examples. So just to refer to it, so I'm not going to read them out. And regarding North Korea, many experts are paying attention to this issue. When they have the party convention, there was a pre-announcement in the early Feb. And they said they're going to have the plenary session at the end of the Feb. And they are going to cover agriculture as one of the top agenda. But that kind of pre-announcement was unprecedented. The party is having the same meeting 2 times within the 2 months. And many people believe that North Korea is putting a lot of focus on agriculture and there will be a significant shift in their policy direction. And that kind of plenary session was held from the Feb 26th to the March 1st of the 2023. And that had been covered by the Central News Agency of North Korea. According to the news coverage, the key agenda can be summarized. The first one is the assessment of the performance of the agriculture and the rural sector in 22. And the second item is the future task for achieving the grain production. The third one is the country's guiding principle for agriculture and what kind of task should be conducted, especially to expand the rural construction. These are the 4 key agenda. But I don't think this is something new. This is nothing new actually. Because the pre-announcement was made, many people paid attention, but I don't think there is a significant change or very special. But there can be 2 implications we can infer. The first one is agricultural policy was scoped down. In the past, the scope was too broad and the feasibility was not that high. However, even though the scope has become narrow, but it became more feasible considering the reality. That can be one of the implications. The second one is some of the policies were scoped down once again, as I said. In 2022, the agricultural production and the food supply have not been fully discussed in their meeting. But what we can guess from that is, because they did not make any announcement about the food production, actually in 2022, maybe they failed in meeting the target, maybe. However, that does not mean North Korea is in food crisis. The reason I'm telling you like that is because of some facts. The first, last year's food production and this year's food supply have not been covered by the news agency, and that has not been reported in the plenary session, which means they are not in a huge crisis. but they did not make a significant outcome as they expected. When you take a look at the news report, the cabinet members in charge of the economy are now in reflection. What I mean is they are saying we failed to meet the target, so we need some kind of reflection. Secretary of the Agriculture Committee was appointed in the early 2022, and his position was retained, which means the agriculture sector is not in great crisis. However, once again, we cannot anticipate significant transition in their policy. Last but not least, let me give you general assessment and outlook. In the early 2022, there was a red flag about the food and agriculture in North Korea. First, because of the sanction and COVID-19, the isolation become more significant. Second, in the spring season, the weather condition was so poor. And again, the chemical fertilizer supply was in short. Last, the COVID-19 outbreak was widely spreading across North Korea. In the last May, they were concerned about a significant risk. However, even under this situation, North Korea produced more than 4.5 million tons of the crops. That means the government control has been strengthened. And because of the government planning and control, probably they were able to produce as much as 4.5 million. The short-term outcome was pretty much effective because of the control from the central government. However, on the long term, there can be two-fold scenario. It can get better or it can get worse. The COVID lockdown is lifted and they have a better trading conditions. And now they are expanding their growth for the wheat and the barley, and there will be more wheat production as time goes by. Compared to the last year, the weather conditions will be better this year. And if that's the case, their production can get better. Also, because of the new Cold War, China and Russia will be standing at the back of North Korea. So there can be more support from China and Russia toward North Korea, which means the food production can increase over last year. Next year, food supply can get better. However, there's another scenario. Because of the lockdown and the sanction, the cumulative effect can have negative blow to North Korean economy. Last year, the condition was really poor and unfavorable, but they produced 4.5 million tons because they relied on the central planned and controlled economy. It can have the short-term outcome. Yes, they made a short-term outcome. If the short-term outcome cannot be achieved this year, just like last year, in that case, there can be some negative blow to the North Korean economy. So we need to take a look at which scenario is more feasible between these two. On the long term, yes, we do not know, but we cannot be positive because the fundamental issues have not been resolved. The fundamental issue in North Korean agriculture is the lack of capital and delays in reform. And those two issues are not likely to be resolved at the same time. So for the long term, I say the long-term view is quite cloudy. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Young-hoon. Thank you for your comprehensive overview of the situation that North Korea is facing in the agricultural sector. Can you please stop sharing your slides? Okay, thanks. Rachel?
Good afternoon from sunny Vienna, Austria, and thank you, GWIX and the IPUS at Seoul National University for hosting this webinar. To build on Dr. Young-Hoon Kim's excellent presentation on the state of North Korea's agriculture and agricultural policy, I will start with a brief history of North Korea's economic reform. I will then review the current state of North Korea's agricultural reform as seen through North Korean state media, and close off with the prospects of North Korean reform, agriculture and otherwise. To start with the background, Kim Jong-un reportedly ordered economic officials and academics to formulate a set of reform initiatives as soon as his father died in December 2011. Policies were developed and refined after trial runs before being rolled out nationwide. Kim Jong-un's reform measures, which North Korean media to this day refer to as economic management methods, were rolled out in phases by sector within the first 3 years of Kim's rule. First was agricultural reform, known as the plot responsibility system within the subwork team management system, which was made official in February 2014. Second was reform on the industrial side, known as the Socialist Enterprise Responsibility Management System, or for short, SERMS. Last reform came in the financial banking and banking sector, made official in Kim's letter to a national meeting of banking and financial officials in December 2015. The crux of Kim's reform measures was decentralization and incentivizing individual workers and economic units by giving them greater latitude in planning, production, and management of resources and profits. In terms of the current state of agricultural reform, it is premature to say that North Korea has rolled back on agricultural reform, but it would be fair to say that it has come to a standstill. North Korea's latest party plenary meeting in late February garnered much attention due to the fact that it was convened so soon after the December party plenary meeting, and because it was specifically about agricultural issues. And this is something that Dr. Kim also mentioned in his presentation. But to our disappointment, it was largely a repetition of existing policies and instructions, plus renewed emphasis on discipline and state control. This indicated a lack of ideas, or perhaps even willingness, to improve farming without compromising Pyongyang's foremost policy priority in the economic sector, which is greater centralization. The lackluster state of North Korea's farming makes more sense and appears more deeply problematic when viewed in tandem with the North Korean state media's handling of the plot responsibility system within the subwork team management system since early 2022 that suggested the country may be reviewing its agricultural reform policy more fundamentally. There have been two notable changes since early 2022. Mentions of this terminology dropped significantly in volume, and state media also ceased using this term at any authoritative level. By contrast, up until late December 2021, the North Korean cabinet premier and the agriculture minister were publicly supporting the plot responsibility system in speeches and on-site guidance visits to farms. The party daily published articles dedicated to the plot responsibility system as well. Ironically, just before we started seeing this change in 2022, North Korea held a party plenary meeting in December 2021, where Kim Jong-un presented a new program for socialist rural construction. A plausible key objective of this program was to keep farmers motivated, which was evidenced by a decision to write off cooperative farms' debts to the state. The significant change in state media's treatment of the plot responsibility system after this party plenary meeting was held, however, suggests a leadership decision to no longer play up the plot responsibility system as a means of incentivizing farmers to increase production. Why does this matter? Because in North Korean state media, nothing is by chance. And if we can successfully wade through the heavy propaganda, we can find out a great deal about North Korea's policy intentions by parsing what it says and how it says it. So this is not the only change we saw in 2022. In fact, it is consistent with a change detected in Pyongyang's stance on the industrial side of reform. North Korean media as of late April 2022 altogether ceased mentioning SERMs at authoritative levels, such as high-level officials' remarks or speeches, or in newspaper editorials, which serve as policy guidelines. Even before April 2022, North Korean media did not mention SERMs too often, probably because the leadership felt it was still a work in progress. But 1 year after complete silence on this terminology, which is the hallmark of Kim Jong-un's reform on the industrial front, and was even codified in the North Korean constitution in April 2019, is abnormal. Worth noting is that North Korean officials and media continue to endorse both the plot responsibility system on the agricultural side and SERMs on the industrial side of reform, even after the 8th Party Congress in January 2021, which cemented North Korea's shift to greater centralization of the economy. Thus, the developments we have seen since early 2022 reflect North Korea's continuing shift to a harder line policy across all domestic and foreign policy realms. In the economic policy arena, this translates into greater central control and curbed freedom for individual economic units and work and farms. As an example, the North Korean cabinet premiere in February 2022 pledged to continue to restore the state's unitary trade system, which seemed to mean a shift away from a policy of giving greater freedom to companies to conduct trade. So what does this all mean for reform prospects? North Korea continues to mention economic management methods, again, a broader reference to Kim Jong-un's reform measures. As recently as this past January, the cabinet Premier Kim Dok-hun said the cabinet would come up with optimized economic management methods and continuously perfect them. This indicates North Korea has not altogether given up on the idea of reform, and rather is still working on them after more than a decade. The information we have been able to glean from state media in recent years strongly indicates that North Korea thinks it can develop a set of reforms that are highly centralized and controlled. The question then is, will those still be reform? They are certainly not what Kim Jong-un originally had in mind, because what he had in mind originally was greater decentralization, giving greater freedom to individual economic units and workers. To add to the not so rosy prospects, we need to view North Korea's reform in the broader context of its defense and foreign policy, because it will have a major impact on the leadership's calculations about reform. So first of all, North Korea has indicated that it will give priority to the defense industry and has signaled to the people that they will have to tighten their belts for a while longer. For example, after the party plenary meeting in December 2022, there has been an uptick in emphasis on a self-sufficient economy, with one article explicitly saying a country's economy is not an equal measure of its national power. Naturally, the more a country invests in national defense, the less resources that remain for the civilian economy, and that in turn spells bad news for economic reform. Secondly, there has traditionally been a correlation between North Korea's willingness to engage with the US and its desire for economic reform. Viewed from this vantage point, prospects for North Korea's economic reform becomes worse, at least in the near to the medium term, because it has no appetite for talks with the US at the moment. Perhaps the bigger problem is Pyongyang's longer-term calculus about reform. And I will end my opening remarks here and would be happy to share more of my thoughts in our follow-on discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's already 9:35. I was hoping to have a couple of minutes for a discussion. So, Homsu, if you forgive me, let me just steal a couple of minutes from your second session and ask this one quick question for the speakers. So, Rachel and Young-hoon, probably after, from the audience point of view, after listening to your presentations, they would, ask this question. So, Kim Jong-un, he doesn't seem to be excited about implementing his promised reform measures or decentralization measures. But at the same time, North Korea has been facing very tough situation, sanctions and COVID. And a lot of people, including experts, predicted some serious food crisis in North Korea, but it didn't happen. It's not perfect situation, but they're modeling through. We don't hear any news about famine, either. So how would you explain this situation? What would be the big missing part here for the prediction that there will be some serious food crisis in North Korea?
Dr. Kim, did you want to go first, or should I go?
Rachel, you just started.
I'm sure Dr. Kim will have more to say on this, but I can't remember the last time we have seen reports about North Korea having a plenty amount of food. I think their food shortages, our food situation is always, it's a chronic shortage, right? Every year it's chronic. There's a chronic shortage, and I think what made what triggered part of the reason this speculation about a North Korean food crisis was triggered was because of what Kim Jong-un said in April 2021, I believe, when he referred to the arduous march. That was in reference to party functionaries and workers, but I think that got translated or interpreted as somehow a national movement, and it, I think, brought up memories in many people's minds about the 1990s. Personally, I think that the border lockdown measures that North Korea has implemented over the past 3 years, I think we're starting to see some signs that it's going to remove some of those border lockdown measures, but they still continue. And personally, I don't think that North Korea would have continued to implement those border lockdown measures if the situation was critical. That's my personal view.
All the people expected that there will be a food crisis, and many people were concerned. Especially last year, the food supply will be to the a famine line. That's what many people said. Up until the food data was released, many people worried about the food supply of this year before they saw the data. I would say last year, they somehow dodged the worst situation. Of course, it was worrisome. However, they avoided the worst case scenario. So I would like to explain why they were able to avoid the worst case scenario. First, actually, they were facing worst situation over and over again. Second factor is the nature of agriculture. In other service sector, in other industry, yes, the dependence on trade is really important. You need to import energy, capital goods. Without the trade, the industry itself is going lackluster. In other industries, however, in the agriculture, it's different. Of course, there are some imported items, I know, but except for those imported items, many of the resources can be circulated and fully utilized within North Korea. They have land, they have labor forces, which is the most important factor. They have land, labor force, and as long as they have a good weather condition, yes, they can keep the production level up to par. So they are keeping the agricultural production up to par. So won't say we didn't see a significant worsening last year. However, still last year, yes, it was a little bit, I would say, more worse compared to other previous data. However, their production was still 4.5 million, even though that was a relatively worse. Again, it was possible because of the short-term effect from the central control and central planning. they mobilized the labor forces and they distributed some of the outcome and products controlled strongly by the central government. That's why they were a little bit more efficient compared to last year. The production itself was not that good, but it was not the worst. But again, that is a short-term benefit. And I'm worried what if the central control can have a good outcome in the long term as time goes by. The effect will wane down and probably it's going to have negative blow to the North Korean economy and North Korean agriculture.
Thank you, Pomsu. Sorry about that, but
It's
I think
okay.
you can take the full 30 minutes, and then we can still have some Q&A. So.
Okay, so as Yono mentioned, first session scheduled 30 minutes and second session scheduled 30 minutes, but we are about 12 minutes late, but I think it's okay. So we will have the 30 minutes second session. Session 2, assessing North Korea's financial reform measures. In the session 1, we will focus on agricultural reform, and in session 2, we will focus on financial reform. Bill Brown, will you have your presentation first?
Let me just jump right into it, though. My topic is North Korean finance, but I have a subtopic called, titling the paper, Kim Jong-un's idle money conundrum. Okay, idle money conundrum. And the exam at the end of this some webinar will be, you have to tell me what the idle money conundrum is. Okay. In 13 December 2015, Kim Jong-un published a letter to the assembled banking and finance functionaries meeting in Pyongyang. Okay, and I wanted to read just a little bit of this letter. It's very, very interesting to me. Quote, "The sovereignty of the country is being violated as currencies of other countries are publicly circulating at home. But the financial and banking sector has not taken decisive measures." This is 2015. "The flaws appearing in financial and banking work owe to the fact that the functionaries of this sector lack the revolutionary consciousness that they are masters in charge of the country's economy and have fallen into defeatism and are unable to implement with a do-or-die spirit the party's fiscal and financial policies." Now, this is translated by our own Rachel Lee, if I'm not correct. Rachel has, and I should say, I used to work with Rachel and her partner in this, Bob Carlin, back way long ago. Okay, so we know each other well. Rachel translated this and did a really great article I want to mention also. But this is 2015, Kim Jong-un blasting his functionaries, right? His financial planning functionaries, and saying the country's sovereignty is violated by the use of foreign currency. 8 years later, important changes have been made in stabilizing North Korea's currency and in lessening inflation, but at a cost to the system's growth aspirations and potentially to the regime's control over the people and the economy. You'll see that I'm basically much more optimistic, basically because of that. I think that people are getting more control, slowly. US dollars and Chinese yuan cash continue to circulate widely, often held in reserves, apparently not by the state, but by the citizens. Ironically, despite Kim's well-founded concerns over loss of sovereignty, this use of foreign currency may be saving the yuan by forcing the authorities to print less of it, raising its relative value and causing the very tight monetary and fiscal policies, slowing growth and restraining state expenditures. Most importantly, for the first time since the DPRK was created, with relatively stable money, the public can save at least a little bit for their own financial future. Lessening dependence on the party and the state, I think a scary thought for Kim and his regime. The trick for Kim, as he seems to understand in his letter, is to take those savings and put them to use, investing in capacity building. So far, this does not seem to be happening. The savings seem to go under the proverbial mattresses and in US $100 bills. Idle money, as Kim complains. Kim tackles a host of other financial issues in his letter, trying to square the contradictions of what we would call capitalism and his socialism. And I expect he confuses everybody. Now, the discipline of finance, if you think money, credit, capital, and the subject of North Korea don't usually mix very well. And you add reform to the picture and not many want to touch it, least of all Kim Jong-un. But it's something as leader of his country he can't avoid. And we, if we are to understand North Korea, must not either. And in this respect, I really want to congratulate Rachel Lee and Bob Carlin, my other former colleague, for their work in Stinson's 38 North in bringing to light this very important letter on banking as translated in their December 2021 article. Now, I know the Korean side, you've looked at this a lot, but I think on the American side, we've been weak in reading North Korean literature, and this is where Rachel is helping a whole lot. I have some differences with their analysis, mainly about what's causing the changes, but their research in how North Korean scholars are using the letter is illuminating. Understanding the country's financial predicament. It's really the fight over who controls money, whether it's the state or the people, can go a long way to figuring out our best ways of influence in dealing with Pyongyang. Now, I can go through some principles on finance, so I won't do this right now. The key thing is finance is highly integrated. It starts from your own wallet, your own personal affairs, and it goes all the way to balance of payments in the nations. And it's all can be dollars or foreign money. This is what's concerning Kim in his letter. He dabbles in all these issues and kind of makes some really important points. A lot of it is about capitalism. Of course, he doesn't call it capitalism. He calls it socialism. But I think any scholar looking at it can see the capitalism coming through. But his article shows that he's no capitalist. As he says in his letter, a socialist state should own all of the country's capital, the means of production, and should direct its formation and use by powerful state planning, what we call a command economy. In other words, the state should own and direct investment, not the people through their banks or markets. Kim repeatedly states his frustration that this planning isn't working. Well, it didn't work anywhere else. Blaming the functionaries, and he complains the control and circulation of money has spread far beyond the confines of the state system. Wow. He's just acknowledging reality here. We all know that. In fact, this kind of system has always broken down, and it's usually created a famine. But the tools that he's talking about in terms of controlling the situation and reforming it sound very much like capitalism. The functionaries probably understand this a lot better than he does, that these tools that he's talking about are likely to only accelerate change and raise state-private tensions. Now, I can go into a little bit of the history. I won't do that here. A lot of the letter is directed toward trying to resolve this lack of trust in North Korean won. It had been devastated. It was not real money. And this is where I think he's made very good progress during his tenure in creating a won that has retained its value for 6-7 years now. And that's what allows markets to work much better. That allows people to save money they don't invest it, they save money, they just keep it, but it's not falling up, it's not collapsing in inflation. A large part of his concern is this idle money, that is cash held by citizens and enterprises, not deposited in banks. So a lot of his emphasis here is improving the banks, creating what he calls commercial banks. Not really commercial, and well, it could end up like commercial banks in China, a very positive development. Not yet, though, I don't think. This has caused savings to increase, and an increase in savings, like it would anywhere, has reduced inflation and strengthened the currency. But the problem, as he points out, is the savings aren't being used to finance new investment. That's what's idle. It's the banks or the people suck up the money and don't spend it. There's a lot of good things about that, but of course it's bad for growth. Now, really interesting, Kim in his letter seems to allow that these new branch banks, these commercial bank branches of the central bank, to use what he calls, quote, international tools. I think that's really, Rachel can correct me, but I think that's really a cover for capitalism. The international tools are capitalism, no doubt about it. That's how we define capitalism. Interest rates, profits, that kind of thing. A return on your deposit. So you put money in the bank and you get something back. The new rules seem to allow for that. It's really phenomenally, and I think the banks are now, some of them are giving out like 10% interest. Very, very interesting development for a socialist country. It's not enough to suck in the money because there's so little trust in one. People will think it's going to go away again. People can buy dollars. This is the incredible thing about North Korea that we have to understand about their economy. The dollarization to which he first refers, the loss of sovereignty. So and this is not particularly new for Korea, back in the Joseon dynasty forever. The government runs into trouble and foreign money, usually copper coins or Chinese copper coins or gold dollar, Mexican dollars would come in and be used as money. So it's not new to Korea. But what's been happening is these dollars and yuan have been seeping in and now circulate widely as a currency. This again allows people to save money. The money is $100 bills under their mattresses, if you think about it that way. It's not spent. So it doesn't create investment. The letter, you can see a huge contradiction in it because he's talking about the functionaries wanting to recontrol money. The state needs to control money through the planning system. He says that over and over. But he's also wanting the functionaries to be creative and figure out ways to use the money. Well, that's good luck with that. I hope they are creative. And I think actually they are becoming more creative. This is what's so interesting. It's so important, I think, for us to watch. About out of time, I have a bunch of other things to point out. I think, though, a lot of what we see in North Korea is illustrative of this shortage of money, shortage of money that's raised its value, stopped inflation, but has stopped investment in its tracks. So you don't see, you see elaborate government kind of investment projects. They're never finished, right? The Pyongyang hospital is a great example. They can build something because they have military workers to build it, and they have lots of stored cement. But they can't, even the government, even Kim Jong-un can't provide the money to buy the instruments, all the furniture, all the stuff that goes into the hospital. So it just sits there idle. You see the same thing with a lot of the tourist projects. You don't see it, I don't think, with the apartments, because the apartments, people are spending their own money. This is really a great thing to furnish them, but it's outside the realm of the state. So, in summing it up, as I say, I'm a little more optimistic that basically they've lost control of their state planning. I think we all know that. And this is by now, and then they lost control of their money with foreign money coming in. In a lot of ways, it's like Hong Kong. It's a very liberal monetary establishment where you don't use your own money. You can use foreign money. Incredibly changed. And they're fighting that. It's very hard for the government to deal if it can't print its own money. It can't print money because people will sell it quickly and buy dollars. So it's a very constrained system, and they're working on it. This letter shows that there's a lot of work being done on it. 8 years later, we don't see a lot of changes, but we have seen them control the currency, the inflation, and the value of the currency. I have a couple of graphs that can show that, but that's enough for me right now because I want to listen to really great paper by Dr. Chung.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Brown. Before turning to Professor Chung, I have a short question. Your presentation on idle money was very, very interesting, but I'm wondering, is it possible to estimate the amount of the idle money or the amount of the dollar, what Chinese yuan circulate in North Korea? Is there any way where I just wondering, yes.
Yeah, I have a discussion of that, and is how do they get it? How do they get all these dollars? I think it's historically coming in. I think a lot of it comes in via remittances from expatriate Koreans. People like people in China, there are a lot of them. China, Russia, Japan, and the US. And they send their relatives, $1,000 a year, something like that, and it piles up over the years. And the interesting thing about these is that I think it's largely private. The government gets its take, but they can't just, because a lot of these are government people. So government people get their $1,000 and, they pony up a gift, Kim Jong-un, but they keep a lot of it. So a lot of this is private money. That's my main point. And the government is trying to take it. Now, how much is there? I suspect it's on the order of $1 billion or so. Really, we should be able to ask our Treasury Department. It's their notes. They should know. Fact is, they don't. It's extraordinary. They don't know how much how many US dollar bills are in North Korea. I think there are largely $100 bills. And I have another discussion, interesting one, I think, because the Chinese money is in there also. It's different than, it's crazy the way the two trade with each other. And I wanted to, maybe in the discussion, I can talk about that a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Now that we will invite the second speaker, Professor Chung. Please have your presentation.
All right. It's a great challenge to finish this up in 7 minutes, but let me use some key slides and deliver the main messages. And this is the slide that shows the evolution of the North Korea's financial system, 1945 until now. And there have been several occasions to establish the financial system and the legal structure, but perhaps the most important event was the arduous March in 1990s when the entire financial system collapsed. And they tried to attract the foreign capital, but that was not that successful. And then only in 2000, the Joseon 중앙은행, it's Joseon Central Bank, North Korea's central bank, started to all make digitize its tasks. It's quite a surprise. Which means that before that, it was really messenger based. And then in 2006, the so-called commercial bank law was established. My guess about the need for this law is the failure in 1990s to compensate the lack of funding from the foreign countries, push them to try to mobilize the funding from inside. And to do that, there is a fundamental limitation for the Joseon 중앙은행 can do as a central bank. So they wanted to shift the unitary system, which is in line with the central planning. And actually, the unitary system is a prerequisite to implement the full central planning. And they gave up and tried to shift to the dual system, which was not that effective. And then there was a big shock, which happened in 2009, the currency reform. And then that was a critical moment when there was a hyperinflation. And then as Dr. Brown suggested, the huge dollarization and also yuanization has started. And the real reform has begun with the revision of the central bank law and the commercial bank law in 2015, when the central bank allowed the so-called commercial bank to have their own autonomous accounting system. And also, they delegated all these commercial intermediary activities to the central banks, commercial banks. But that was a kind of big move. But is it successful? Answer is not so much. And there is a big reason for it. Let me go through one by one why those reform measures were not that successful. First of all, this shows the governance structure of North Korean banks. As you can see, it's written in Korean, but let me read it for you. At bottom boxes, it includes various kinds of North Korean banks. But if you trace to the top, there is always either the cabinet or central government, or the party, or the military. So either of these three entities tightly control the funding flows, so that all these the fundamental roles of these banks is fiscal purposes mainly, rather than the intermediation purpose. That's the fundamental problem of North Korean financial system. And after the reform, the structure has changed a little bit, in a way that there are three groups or three sectors in financial sector. One is the central bank. Now central bank really controls about the monetary policy. And there is also some on the right part, finance companies. And in the middle, there are three groups of commercial banks in a broad sense. First type of commercial bank is the state commercial bank, which is mainly about the foreign trade payment system. And this local commercial bank, there are 12 of them because there are 12 provinces in North Korea. And also the foreign investment bank is also labeled as a commercial bank. And like a joint banking with the foreign banks or the branches of the foreign bank or the foreign investment bank. And in a narrow sense, the commercial bank means this local commercial bank, 12 of them. But in terms of its range of allowed tasks, all these three types of commercial banks can handle those financial intermediation roles after 2015. That does not mean that each single bank is actually performing all that role, but legally they are allowed. And then another key difference is they now can follow their own accounting system. Maybe this graph also may help. Here, let me first explain the right panel. In the past, the central bank issued the preliminary money. It's just the planning, how much money to print. And there is a branches of the central bank. And then actually these branches actually issue the real money to the companies and institutions. And if the actual delivery of money is if there are any surplus, it's collected back to the headquarters, central bank. So this is how basically the money has been circulated before 2015. But now the central bank, they issue money directly to the commercial bank, not to the companies. That's a critical difference. And also the central bank issues the banknotes to commercial bank like a loan form. And there they also require collateral. And then this commercial bank deliver these monies to the companies and institutions based on the production plan. So the real delivery agency of the national currencies or the banknote is now commercial banks. So, well, if you just mechanically compare these two pictures, you may think, well, commercial bank is just replacing the branches of the former central bank. But there are two key differences. One is now the commercial banks can charge their own interest rate, and they can request collateral. And also they are requested to place collateral to the central bank. That's quite a difference, actually. So that's the maybe the outcomes of the financial reform to mobilize or circulate the funding flow of funds much better. These are quick summaries of very complicated results of how those fundings are flowed. For example, production funds is mainly delivered from the bank to the companies, and but between intercompany flow of funds is very small, and there are these companies, and the Kyopso is company and Kigwan institution, and they request or they propose their needs of funding, and then they deliver the money according to this structure. But it's always there is a shortage. That shortage is compensated by the so-called private sector loan, 사금융, from the household sector. And another interesting structure about loan delivery is the banks are allowed to deliver production funding only to the companies and institutions, not to the households. So this is legally prohibited. So but the new commercial banks, their main mission is to attract the deposit from the household sector. But as I told you, the commercial banks can accept the deposit, but they don't deliver any loans or consumption loans. In this way, the current commercial banks are not intermediaries. That's the critical pitfall of this flow of funds system in North Korea. And the cash is a little more difficult, but maybe it's the easiest way to understand about this cash flow is before the reform, each companies can have only one account in one bank, and no other, there is a one-to-one mapping actually. And that one account requirement is relaxed, which means that the one bank requirement is still there, but no more one account. There can be multiple accounts, and there are two types of accounts in a given for a given company. One can be just basic account. The other is cash account. So it was very difficult to withdraw cash. If you see the panel C, every single household cannot withdraw their own savings directly. They have to request the withdrawal to the banks, and then the banks deliver those withdrawal through the any the work step from the banks. But when this bank step deliver the withdrawal to the each individual, they charge like a fees 20 to 30%. So it means once you place your funding in, it is very, very difficult to place the withdraw their own money out. So as the bill just suggested, there was a 10% interest rate. And then before the reform, the typical interest savings interest rate was 3 to 5%. So it's more than double. But because of this structure, many North Korean households think that once the money is going in, it's very hard to getting it out. And then furthermore, because of this 2009 currency reform, the distrust in the North Korean won really it went really bad. And then the actual withholding of idle money is dollar or the yuan, and which they cannot deposit directly. You need to exchange. So that's another hurdle. So there are so many other hurdles to mobilize the savings. So nowadays, that information comes from the interviews. There are kind of commanding orders to deposit their wage income, like some fixed portion, to the commercial banks, but they are not actually listening. Well, the one way this is how this North Korean credit card or the ATM card look like. So they do have this kind of thing. And then this is possible because now the people can open the cash account. From the basic account, you cannot use this online shopping mall. In North Korea, there are very active online shopping sales, but you do need to have that cash account. And I think the big main parts are already explained. Even the North Korean commercial bank tries to use the lottery savings scheme, which goes like if you put the savings 100 and then you get the lottery, and the first prize is you will get 100% of your savings, and second prize 70% of your savings. That's the savings lottery. So that gives another incentive to place your money into the commercial bank. But it was only shortly popular, but not nowadays. China actually faced similar situation in early 1990s. That's the important thing to remember. However, what China did before they tried to mobilize the domestic savings, they made a reform about the financial system per se in 3 steps. The first step is they tried to pull out any commercial activities from the state banks, and then let's set it as like a state level commercial bank, and then turned it into the really private commercial bank. And then the final step is let those commercial banks to compete with each other. But it's almost like the capitalist market system. And then they try to mobilize the savings and try to turn those savings into investment. That happened with this Chinese reform in mid-1990s. So that was why the Chinese financial reform was quite successful. Then, if this is the case, anyway, we do need any compensation mechanism for the lack of funding. And there are 2 other possibilities. One may be just private sector financing, 사금융, but still it charges like a really high interest rate, 30 to 50%. During this arduous march, like 150%, is so huge. But another thing that I recently learned, the source of the funding in private sector, we usually use the term like a 돈주, but there is other entity which plays a crucial role called 돈장사. 돈주 means owner of funding. So they are the capitalists, but they are just owners, but they don't seek to find who needs that money. But there is an entity called the 돈장사. It's actually the 돈장사, the literal meaning is a money merchant. So they are the intermediaries. And they play the role of intermediaries in private sector. And after the reform of 2015, the government tightened its regulations about this private sector financing so that these 돈장사 started to submerge. So they started to disappear. So nowadays, this private sector financing got really dampened because of this. The money is still there, but the intermediary disappeared. And the risks of kind of asking money or the lending money from the 돈주, the risk premium really got increased. So it dried up the actual capital supply from the private sector. And then you may rely on the external funding, and then there are basically two kinds. One is the foreign investment, FDI, through the so-called 합영은행. It's like a joint company, joint venture banking. But most of this joint banking is directly controlled by this central bank or the trade bank. And they are likely to use these investment for the central bank's fiscal purposes, which means the chances of those money can be used for the North Korea's development is quite slim. The other one is foreign assistance from international NGOs. But they have their own agenda, and it's always stringed for specified uses. And it's likely that there may be a gap between the actual demand for investment and actual supply of money from the international NGO. And the microfinance programs can be another one, but it takes the form of these international NGOs typically. But these days, this MFI kind of heavily criticized because they are really turned to the high interest rate charging commercial programs because the funding size of MFI really grew up, and they are now competing with actual commercial banks in the international market. So it creates the debt overhang problem. So external funding still is a possibility, but it seems to have a clear limitations. So this I will skip. So my own suggestion is to utilize, to promote, and how can I say, to facilitate actual financial intermediation is to use the community finance. And maybe it is well aligned with the need for the agricultural reform, because this community finance usually starts from the rural areas. And there is one great model which was successful, which helped the rural development in South Korea. And that financial arm was a 새마을금고. It's called MG in English. And it's really a voluntary-based formation. And it's the local, there is no center, there's a coordination center, but the real units of financing or the intermediation is the local villages or sometimes urban areas. And this is a financial co-op, and they actually utilizes various interesting schemes to savings mobilization. So they start from savings before investment. So they emphasize a lot about internal funding. After you accumulate internal funding, they transform the internal funding into the investment before they attract the external funding. So this is how actually mobilize the savings. They traveled and they just placed the savings device at home, and that kind of and they also emphasized a lot about financial literacy education, and this kind of collection of savings now turned to the South Korean 새마을금고's asset value is now more than $200 billion. If with that kind of funding, perhaps we can better rely on the effective financial reform. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, personally, I learned very much about the situation of the North Korean economy. Actually, at first I thought it sounds very strange, yeah, because you mentioned that there are a banking system and the commercial banks. So I'm not a North Korean expert. I just the political theorist. As a political theorist, your presentation was very, very strange. Anyway, thank you very much. And for the interest of time, I think it would be better to have a Q&A session right now. Maybe it's Yono Kim. If you do not mind, please have the Q&A session.
So let me just take a couple of questions that has not been addressed yet. So this is from Mark Tokola. What is North Korea's comparative economic advantage? In the absence of sanctions and controls, should they be exporting minerals and importing food rather than trying to grow it?
Yes, and in fact, their non-ferrous metals are extremely high demand right now. They should be shifting. They've got all these rare earths. They're in a great spot to export, but they can't. So yeah, I would say their agriculture, I would say, Dr. Kim, you might disagree, but I would say the North Korean farmer is about the least productive farmer in the world. And it has nothing to do with how hard he or she works. They work extremely hard, but they just don't have anything to work with. And it's a poor country to try to make. So they need to shift people from farms to working in high-tech areas and in non-ferrous metals. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me move on to the next question from William Newcomb. He's one of our board members at NKEF. Given history of the North Korean won, how can North Koreans have any confidence in its continuing stability? Suspecting high velocity to get rid of it ASP, or has something fundamental changed? Professor Chung, did you want to answer this question?
Yeah, actually not much. Yeah, not much, because unless they have a capacity to attract the domestic savings and safely secure the internal funding accumulation, it's very difficult. So we do need really financial reform is not just a monetary reform. The financial architecture needs to be rebuilt. Otherwise, this mistrust, the distrust about the North Korean won will continue.
But day to day, the won has risen in value over the past couple of years. It's gone down recently, but it's held its own now for about 7 or 8 years. So I think over time, whereas you might not want to use it for savings, you don't mind putting it in your wallet. It's not going to disappear next week. That's the way it was under Kim Jong-il, his father. It was destroyed by. So they have created a little bit of trust in won, I would say.
Yeah, if I may, I want to share some interesting episode about this trust in North Korean won. In North Korea, there is a term like money laundering, and it doesn't mean that you need to corruptly send the money outside, but you really need to wash the $100 bill repeatedly.
Okay.
So, by not printing it, you create more value. And I don't think they're printing very much won.
One last question from Kim Byung-ro at SNU, Seoul National University. This is directed to Professor Chung. So in 2015, you said North Korea started the like a financial individual financial management system for provinces. Is it still working well?
I think that works well because the actually central bank does not want to take the responsibility, and the problem is the savings mobilization is still very slow. So it's called 독립채산제 in Korean. Yeah.
Okay.
But Yunho, one point I wanted to make though with Dr. Zhang's article, he talked about the use of electronic money in smartphones. I follow Chinese finance quite a lot, and man, the change in China in the last few years, the use of smartphones is just phenomenal. They had a lot of the same trouble with their commercial banks. Their commercial banks, much better than North Korea's, but they were basically used to fund the government. So they would suck in deposits, they would pay pretty good interest, but the money would all be channeled to state enterprises. That's the problem we have with China, all this huge flow of money to state enterprises. But you know, what's changed everything is Alipay and WeChat Pay. Big commercial private enterprises outside of the banking system. They use the banking system, but you know, you can, everybody has their smartphone. 80% of people have smartphones. They buy everything, sell everything, buy stocks. They can buy in the New York Stock Exchange with their WeChat Pay. It's phenomenally capitalist. And it's just next door to North Korea. I mean, the same cell phone, you know, in Dandong, and, you know, I can't have a hard time believing that the North Korean authorities are going to be able to stop this movement into North Korea using electronic money. And that will just drastically change that country for the better, I think.
Right. You know, I'm always get excited when somebody talk about cell phones in North Korea. You understand that. And I was also, you know, curious about the impact of, you know, information technology on North Korea's agricultural sector. I understand last week, 노동신문 reported that their, you know, agricultural ministry just, you know, distributed a new smartphone application, 황금 열매, golden fruit, that allows the farmers to have 먼 거리 서비스 봉사, so long distance information service. So I don't know how that works, but obviously North Korea, they try to apply information technology to every you know, important economic sector, including agricultural sector. But with that, I think we have to close today's webinar. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers for joining us today, especially our Korean speakers for staying up late at night for us. Hopefully you will have a good night's sleep there. And I also like to thank our GWIX team for putting this together, and the simultaneous interpreters for their excellent service. And of course, thank you all for joining us. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. Thank you.